Well, I had some really awesome experiences in different communities. And like I mentioned, my religious upbringing and a lot of parts of that were not awesome, but the solidarity side was pretty awesome. And then after that, like in Wellington, where I went to university and lived for a long time in New Zealand, there's a really awesome music scene there. Very, very high proportion of the people are in bands, a lot of like underground, house parties and festivals and music labels, and a real sense of like DIY. We're all in it together. Everyone's helping, everyone's sharing gear with each other, everyone's sharing opportunities. It's a really fun kind of scene. And then beyond just the music, there's all other kinds of arts as well. And then there's also a lot of people in Wellington, because it's a university town. There's a lot of like young adults living together in shared housing. And then once you're living together and you're playing music together, it's sort of like, well, then people jam on work projects, and you get all these kind of like opportunities in life kind of emerge from this social fabric. And then there's the Inspiral community, which you mentioned in the intro. So that's like a network of social entrepreneurs. And that's a bit more, like with the music scene, like I described, it's very open-ended. Like anyone can kind of rock up and find their way in. Whereas Inspiral is much more structured and boundaried, and it's like a private club, let's put it that way. And because it's more intentionally structured and more engineered, more designed in a way, it has more capacity for collaboration in certain ways. So like I basically had these experiences in different communities where it feels like, hey, something's really happening here. Like there's some kind of collective spirit that's really thriving. And then, yeah, I started traveling with my wife Nati and visiting lots of other parts of the world where I just kept meeting people that were desperate for that thing that was second nature to me. And so the first kind of impulse to me as an engineer is like, well, how do we rebuild, or like, what is the infrastructure? What's the framework? What's the nuts and bolts that makes that kind of community happen? And as an engineer, it's quite frustrating because the answer is really complex and nuanced and context dependent, because it depends on like, yeah, what kind of norms you were raised with in your family, and what are the, like I talked about living in shared houses, like that's easy to do in Wellington because of the way the architecture works. But if you try and do that in London, the local laws in the UK make it really difficult to get a bunch of adults living together. This and if all the architecture in the city like single occupancy apartments, it's like hard to get 6, 7, 8 adults living together. Like it's not really supportive of that. So there's lots of contextual factors, from architecture to legislation to culture to psychology to technology, all these kind of forces that create the conditions for what kind of community or what kind of groups can form. And so for me as an engineer to say like, oh, you just need to do X, Y, and Z, and then you can make a community, like it's really not straightforward. It's really not straightforward at all. And so Microsolidarity is kind of like an answer to how would we start 200 Inspirals around the world? Like what would that need? Like how would you get these tight-knit, high impact, high trust networks of support? How could you boot those up in lots of different cultural contexts, lots of different economic contexts? And because I'm trying to design it in a way where it really adapts to lots of different contexts, it's kind of vague. It's kind of lacking in details in some ways that might be frustrating. And that's why like the framework is kind of in some important ways it's empty. There's a lot where it's like it's kind of up to you to figure it out in your local context, and I'm trying to give enough guidance to set you off in the right direction. But the point is that you, as soon as possible, get engaged, instead of like trying to take a one size fits all blueprint off the shelf and say, oh, we just built this thing here like an IKEA bookshelf. It's like as soon as possible you should be in this process of reflection and collective intelligence and discovering your own, like, what are the challenges here and how do we adapt the structure to meet the local needs. So I realize that's all a very abstract answer. But hopefully it illustrates a little bit about, hopefully I've explained a little bit about why it's abstract. And the actual content of the Microsolidarity framework is a lot of it is just focused on group sizes and understanding that like groups of different sizes are good for different things. And people, so one of the pieces of it is like I mentioned, I'm meeting all these people that are really, really lonely, like really suffering from loneliness in a significant way. And a really common theme, I'm in touch with a lot of these people on Twitter. And so they have this kind of like digital connection to some kind of social landscape. And they're desperate to kind of like make it more material, more real, like part of their real everyday life. And time again, I meet people that have this attitude of like, oh, I just need to work on myself. If I just did enough self-development, then I would become acceptable and I would be able to find friends and like build community around me. And for me, one of the principles of microsolidarity is like actually the causality is in the other direction. Like first you find supportive peers and then you grow and change. Like you actually, like you said about your friend calling you out for being a totalitarian, like that's the natural way to learn something, is that you have feedback from supportive peers. And so instead of like, I'm going to go off by myself and somehow work on, pull myself up by my bootstraps, the focus is on finding people that are up for, that are willing to be my companion, even though I'm not a finished product, and to grow in good company with them. So it's like, yeah, this big thing on getting people into small groups where they can have some dependable encounters, like regular encounter with the same small group. You keep showing up. And some of those groups are very kind of emotional. They're kind of like peer coaching or peer counseling kind of. It's a space to, so I call these crews. One of the crews I started was when the pandemic first hit and everyone's freaking out. So I pulled together 5 people that I really trust, and we had a weekly call where we were just kind of like processing what's going on with this pandemic. We're all freaking out. And then other ones are much more practical. It's less about talking about our feelings, and it's more about doing a shared project, like making a band or like building a community garden or something. It's another great way to forge bonds. But yeah, there's this focus on small groups of like 4, 5, 6 people. We call the crew. And then, okay, question is, where do you find your crewmates? Like, how do you find the right people to connect with? And that's where we go to the next order of scale, which is, roughly in the ballpark of like 150 people, which I call the congregation scale. And that's like a kind of nod to my religious past, where the congregation is a couple hundred people, basically, where you want, more open-ended, more different people coming and going. It's like in the music scene that I described, you might have 100 people show up to a party and there's like one person there that's going to be your drummer, and you need to kind of go through this random bumping process to find like who's the person that. So yeah, that's a lot of the emphasis of the community building framework, is that looking at these different scales and understanding like, yeah, I think people need to have these little pods around them to be at their best. And then where do you find your pods? Like in a larger group. And that's these like nested scales of group identity.
Yeah.